I am here with another video for my Bible study project. This week I read Leviticus chapters 6 to 16 and Matthew chapters 25 to 28. So as always, we'll begin with the Old Testament. So what's going on in Leviticus at this point? We start to get the rules for the Israelites, starting with sacrifices, what can and cannot be eaten and who can eat the sacrifices. A huge list of rules for the priests and how they are to be ordained, and rules that basically describe what is unclean and the rituals through which you cleanse yourself again. And no, we don't come to that verse yet. That verse will be next week's video. I'll talk about Leviticus as a whole and talking specifically about what makes something unclean. So various things are mentioned throughout Leviticus as being unclean. So certain animals are unclean, women are unclean after giving birth, men are unclean after emitting semen, women are unclean during menstruation, everyone's unclean if they touch something dead. If you have a skin disease, you are unclean until it's healed or not contagious. And what's interesting is that all these things have to do with death or symbols of death. So for example, the animals forbidden to the Israelites were scavengers who ate dead animals or carnivores who ate blood, because blood is the life force. So when a woman is bleeding, that is symbolic of her life force, draining from her. That's literally her womb, where life is grown and created, is being flushed out of her. And skin diseases like leprosy are deadly if not treated. So the idea here is that God is life, and you can't enter into their presence having death on you or having something that symbolizes death on you. So this is kind of symbolic here, that you can't enter into life with death. There's also some more practical reasons here. So like if certain foods aren't prepared correctly, they can cause sickness and death, particularly pork and shellfish, which are also scavengers who represent death, symbolize death, but are also, causes of death if not prepared properly. Doctors still today recommend that women abstain from sex for a period of time after giving birth, and that's what it says in Leviticus, wait a certain amount of time, so that, gives women a chance to heal, and they may be considered unclean, so don't touch a woman at that time. Which seems very sexist, but it's not, because women need time to heal after giving birth, especially back then when they didn't have a lot of medical intervention to fix things if they went wrong. And again, if you have an infectious disease, be quarantined. Just don't spread that disease to other people. It's a very practical thing to do, right? So again, we see here the practical and the spiritual reasonings combining together. Also, I want to state that being unclean isn't a sin. So menstruating is not a sin. Giving birth is not a sin. Having a skin disease is not a sin. And then we move on to the New Testament. Matthew chapters 25 to 28. And what's going on at this point. So Jesus is telling some more parables to his disciples that basically sum up, be prepared at all times, use what God gives you, and don't hide it away. Jesus also prepares for his death. Judas betrays him. Jesus is put on trial. He's crucified and he's resurrected. So this is the end of the Gospel of Matthew. I want to talk about Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 to 46. And here Jesus is telling people what is going to make them blessed and be able to come into the presence of God. So he says, "For I was hungry, you gave me food. When thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was a stranger, you took me into your home. When naked, you clothed me. When I was ill, you came to my help. When in prison, you visited me." And he says, when you do this to people on earth, you are doing it for me. And these people will sit on the right hand of God. And I think this is a very important rule to follow. And I am going to bring in politics here, because I believe that religion affects our morals, and unfortunately with the current political atmosphere, our morals affect our politics. So religion affects our morals, and morals affect our politics. And I want to point out that this doesn't say, "For I was hungry and you cut my food stamps. I was a stranger and you deported me. I was sick and you denied me health care. I was a child afraid to go to school and you voted with the NRA." We are very clearly told here to fight for social justice. And then I want Matthew 26 verses 6 to 13. In this section, a woman anoints Jesus with some expensive oil, and this causes one of his disciples to ask why they didn't take that oil and sell it and give that money to the poor. To which Jesus replies that you will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. And he basically also says, she's anointing me for my burial because I'm about to die. And some Christians have been accused of mistreating the poor with this verse as an excuse, because the poor are always going to be there. We don't have to worry about them. They're poor for a reason, right? But I don't agree with that. What I'm going to offer up here is a quote from Kurt Vonnegut, who specifically talks about this verse. "Whatever it was that Jesus really said to Judas was said in Aramaic, of course, and has come to us through Hebrew and Greek and Latin and archaic English. Maybe he only said something a lot like, 'The poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me.' Perhaps a little something has been lost in translation. I would like to recapture what has been lost. Why? Because I, as a Christ-worshipping agnostic, have seen so much unchristian impatience with the poor, encouraged by the quotation, 'For the poor always ye have with you.' If Jesus did in fact say that, it is a divine black joke, well suited to the occasion. It says everything about hypocrisy and nothing about the poor. It is a Christian joke, which allows Jesus to remain civil to Judas, but to chide him for his hypocrisy all the same. Judas, don't worry about it, there will still be plenty of poor people left after I'm gone. My own translation does no violence to the words in the Bible. I have changed their order some, not merely to make them into the joke the situation calls for, but to harmonize them, too, with the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount suggests a mercifulness that can never waver or fade." I'm just going to leave it at that. Matthew chapter 26 verses 14 to 16. This is where Judas agrees to betray Jesus to the Pharisees. And I found myself asking, is Judas a bad person? Did Judas know what he was doing? Did he know that this betrayal was kind of necessary to begin this system of pitting Jesus on trial so that he can be crucified and resurrected? And was Judas forgiven? So Judas betrayed Jesus, which is obviously a bad thing if he didn't know exactly what he was doing. But without that betrayal, the whole crucifixion and resurrection would not have happened. So, what's up with Judas? And there's lots of theories, actually. In John and Luke, it's actually stated that Satan made him do it, or that Satan made him do it. In the non-canonical Gospel of Judas, Jesus actually asks Judas to betray him to kind of get things moving along. Historically speaking, Judas may have been disappointed that Jesus wasn't interested in stirring up a rebellion among the Jewish people against the Romans, or he could have just done it for the money. There's an interesting theory also that Judas was predestined to betray Jesus, found in Zechariah chapters 11 verses 12 to 13, but that afterwards he had the choice to ask for forgiveness. So it's interesting, this idea of what happened to Judas. I don't think we get the answers. Matthew chapter 26 verses 36 to 46. Jesus knows what's coming at this point. He tells his disciples what's coming. They know, and he asks them to stay awake with him while he prays, and they actually end up falling asleep. And I think these are some of my favorite verses because they show how human Jesus is. Here we see Jesus anxious about what's to come. It's not an easy thing that he's about to do. He wants to resist it, and he questions God's plans for him repeatedly. He's like, God, can we maybe do this a different way, or do something else, or maybe just not do this at all? And we see this human side of Jesus coming out. After all this prophecy and acknowledging that he is the Messiah, he's now scared, and he asks God to rethink this whole thing, and he craves the company of his friends to help alleviate that grief. And I think that's really interesting side to see. Then we get Matthew 27 verse 46. Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, I'm probably mispronouncing this, but I'll apologize. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, or my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? And this is another example of the humanity of Christ. He feels like God has abandoned him at this point, and he cries out even at this last moment. He has doubts, and I think this makes this sacrifice all that more powerful. He wasn't stoic. He was emotional. He was dying. He was in agony. And that's, really striking to hear him call out, my God, why are you doing this to me? So, in conclusion, the ending of Matthew I find is a lot more convoluted than the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, which I think is interesting. It's not just a straightforward story anymore, but one that raises a lot of questions. I'm also struck by how short the Gospels are, especially in comparison to the stories in the Old Testament. So, for example, like the story of Moses takes up multiple books, but the Gospels are really short in comparison, trying to tell all these stories in such a short amount of time. And I think that's something I need to look more into as to why the Gospels are so short. And I have less to say about the Old Testament at this point, because at this point really it's just a list of rules and guidelines that are all very similar in the ways that you atone for them as well, so it's a lot of repetitiveness. And I'm sure as it moves from these list of rules into more complex plots, again, I'll have more to explore and talk about in these videos. But that's it. Let me know your favorite moment of when Jesus was showing his human side, and thank you for watching.